Every kid in this show is real. Every story is true. And everything you're about to hear really happened. In the year 1812, Louis Braille was 3 years old, a boy, growing up in Guadet, France, a small farming village about 20 miles east of Paris, back in the days when every farm in the country still ran on horses. Not a city, not a place with a hospital or a specialist, or anybody who knew much about medicine at all. A one church, one school teacher kind of village, a long way from anywhere. Louis's father was a saddler. A saddler makes things out of leather, saddles for horses, harnesses, straps and buckles and bridles, all the leather gear that farmers needed back when every farm in France ran on horses instead of engines. The Braille family had been doing it in that village for more than 100 years. His father's workshop was on the ground floor of their house, and if you were 3 years old, it was the best room in the world. It smelled like leather and oil. There were bridles hanging on the walls. There was a big wooden table. And on the table, there were tools. One of them was called an awl. An awl has a short wooden handle with a sharp metal point coming out of it. And it does exactly one thing. It punches holes in leather. Because you can't sew leather without a hole to sew through. So, all day long, Louis's father would take that little pointed tool and push it through a strap. And punch. There'd be a hole. And another punch. And another hole. Louis watched him do it 1,000 times. And then one day, when nobody was in the room, Louis climbed up to the table and picked one up. He wanted to do what his dad did, but he was 3. So when he pushed down on it, it slipped. And Louis got hurt. Badly. In his eye. And remember, this was 1812. Doctors then didn't have the medicines we have now. There was no such thing as an antibiotic. Nobody had invented one yet. So when the hurt eye got infected, there was nothing anybody could give him to stop it. And infections in your eyes can spread from one to the other. So, over the next 2 years, Louis' sight got worse and worse. And by the time he was 5 years old, he couldn't see at all. Now, here's where it gets really sad. Where Louis grew up, at the time he grew up, blind people were not treated well at all. Most of them weren't sent to school. A lot of them ended up begging in the street. But Louis's parents were not going to let that happen. Both of them could read and write, which wasn't true of everybody in a farm village back then, and they wanted their son to be able to do it too. So, his father made him something. He went into the workshop and got a plank of wood and a handful of upholstery nails, the kind with big round heads on them, and he hammered the nails into the board in the shape of a letter. A whole row of nail heads bent into an A, another one for B. Then, he took Louis's hand and put his fingers on it. Feel that? He'd say. That's an A. And that is a B. That right there is a dad in a leather shop with no training and no instructions inventing a way for his son to touch the alphabet. And it worked. Louis learned every letter that way. Now, there was also a priest in the village, Father Paul, who noticed this little boy was quick, really quick, and started teaching him. And when Louis was 7, Father Paul talked the village school teacher into letting him into regular school. Louis, who was the only blind student in the room, went to the top of the class. Which sounds like a happy ending, but it wasn't. And here's why. Louis was the best student in that school at listening. He could remember anything the teacher said. But when the teacher wrote on the board, nothing. When the other kids opened a book, nothing. Louis's whole education had to arrive through his ears, one sentence at a time, from somebody else's mouth. He couldn't read a book, and there was nothing in that village, or that school, or honestly, in most of the world, that was ever going to change that. Somebody was going to have to build it. When Louis was 10, Father Paul found out there was a school in Paris just for blind children. The first one ever built, anywhere in the world. It was called the Royal Institute for Blind Youth. They wrote letters, and the school wrote back and said yes, and they gave Louis a scholarship. In February of 1819, 6 weeks after his 10th birthday, Louis Braille got into a stagecoach with his father and rode 4 hours to Paris. And then his father went home, and Louis stayed. 10 years old, in a city he'd never been to, in a building he'd never touched. A man named Valentin Aoui had started it because he'd seen blind people being made fun of at a street fair in Paris, and it made him furious. His whole idea was, these are children, and children learn things. So, at the Royal Institute, blind kids studied grammar, geography, history, arithmetic, music. They learned trades so they could earn a living. In 1819, this was a radical idea. Nobody else on earth was doing it. Now get this. They had a library. There were about 100 students in that building, but in that library, there were only 14 books. 14 total. And here's why. Aoui had figured out a way for blind people to read, and it went like this. Take a regular letter, a regular capital A, the same shape you'd see in a normal book, but make it huge and press it into thick, wet paper so it stands up off the page. Then, a blind reader can run a finger around the outside of the shape and figure out which letter it is. It works. It genuinely works. Blind children can read books with it. That had never happened before in history. But it's incredibly slow. It took several minutes to get through a single sentence. And because each letter has to be printed so big, the books were enormous. Some of them were too heavy for the younger kids to even pick up. That's why there were only 14 of them. They were hugely expensive and so slow to make. And there's one more thing. To make a page like that, you needed a printing press. A big metal machine, which means a blind person could read one of those books, but a blind person could never make one. In that entire building, 100 students, teachers, the best school for blind people that had ever existed, not one blind person could write down a single word, not a note to a friend, not a shopping list, not even their own name. But fast forward 2 years. In 1821, a visitor came to the school. His name was Charles Barbier, and he was an army officer. And he had brought something with him that he'd invented for soldiers. Here's the problem Barbier had been trying to solve. Imagine you're a soldier at night, and you need to pass a message down the line. If you talk, the enemy hears you. If you light a lamp to read a note, the enemy sees you. So, Barbier came up with a way to write a message in bumps. You punch dots into a piece of paper with a pointed stick, and then in total darkness and total silence, another soldier runs his finger over the dots and reads it. He called it night writing. Now, Barbier's own army had already looked at this and said, too complicated, no thank you. So Barbier thought, well, if it's a way of reading in the dark, maybe blind people would be able to use it. And he brought it to Paris and he showed it to the students. Louis was 12, and Louis went, wait. Because think about it. Dots, punched into paper with a pointed tool, by hand. No printing press, no machine. Any person could do this. But the more Louis used it, the more things were wrong with it. Problem 1. Barbier's dots came in a block that was 2 dots across and 6 dots tall. That's 12 dots, which sounds fine until you try it. Hold up your pointer finger and look at the tip. Just the pad, right at the end. That's the part you read with. That's your whole reading machine right there. Barbier's block was taller than that, so your finger couldn't feel a whole letter at once. You had to move your finger up and down to feel the top part and then the bottom, and then remember both halves and put them together for every single letter. One word could take 100 dots. Problem 2. Barbier's system wrote sounds, not letters. so you couldn't spell anything properly. And problem 3, there were no numbers, no commas, no question marks, and no music, which mattered enormously at this school, because music was how a lot of blind people in France earned a living. So, a 12-year-old boy sat there holding a soldier's invention and thought, this is the right idea. It's just built wrong. So, Louis Braille went to work, and he did not stop for 3 years. He had classes all day, so he did this at night after everybody else went to bed. When school let out for the holidays and he went home to Guadet, people in the village said you'd see him sitting out on the hillside by himself with a paper and a pointed stick in his hands, poking dots. And that tool he was poking dots with, that's called a stylus, a short handle with a sharp point coming out of it. The same kind of tool that punches holes in leather, the kind his father had in the workshop. Well, here's what he figured out. Take Barbier's block and cut it in half, 6 dots instead of 12, 2 across, 3 down. That's it. That's the whole invention. And it's the whole invention because 6 dots fits under your fingertip. All of them, at once. You don't move your finger up and down anymore. You just slide it along the line, and each letter arrives whole in one touch, like a word arrives in your eye when you look at it. 6 little dots. Each one is either bumped or left flat. And if you count every possible way you can arrange that, 1 dot, 2 dots, all 6. Every combination, you get 64 patterns. 64 is enough for every letter of the alphabet, and a comma, and a question mark, and capital letters, and every number. And, because Louis played the organ and he was not about to leave this out, every note of music. He finished it in 1824. He was 15 years old. And then he showed it to the other kids at school. And the other kids at school lost their minds. Because the first time in the entire history of the world, a blind person could pick up a piece of paper and a stylus and write something down, and then hand it to a friend, and the friend could read it. But here's the part of the story most people never hear. The students loved it, yes, but the teachers did not. And the reason is uncomfortable. Almost all the teachers at the school could see, and Louis' dots were a language they couldn't read. If the students all started writing in dots, then suddenly the blind kids in that building would know something their sighted teachers didn't. And some of them didn't like that at all. But Louis kept going anyway. The school's director at the time, a man named Pignet, quietly let the students use it, even though it wasn't official. Louis became a teacher at the school himself. In 1829, when he was 20, he published a book explaining exactly how his system worked, so anyone, anywhere, could learn it. And in front of that book, Louis wrote about Captain Barbier, the army officer whose invention he'd taken apart and rebuilt, and he gave him credit. In Louis' own words, his method gave us the first idea of our own. 8 years later, the school printed the very first full-length book ever made in Louis' dots. It was a history of France. Things were going well. And then, in 1840, the school got a new director. His name was Pierre Armand Dufault. And Dufault did not like the dots. And Dufault was now in charge. So he banned them. Not discouraged, banned. Students caught using Louis' system got punished for it. And then he went even further. Dufault went into that library, the library with the giant heavy books, and by now, also the books written in Louis' dots. And he had them carried out into the courtyard behind the school, and he burned them. 73 of the old embossed books, plus the books in Louis' dots. The whole library, gone in an afternoon. And then he collected the writing tools, the little metal slates, the pointed styluses, everything the students used to make the dots. He took those too. By now, Louis Braille was in his 30s, and he had been working on this since he was 12, and a man he worked for had just set it all on fire. So, this must be the end of the episode, right? You can't fight the guy who runs the building. Except that Dufault had made one mistake, and it was a big one. and it's my favorite thing in this whole story. He took away the tools, but he could not take away the idea, because the kids already knew it. It was in their heads. And a 6-dot code doesn't need a factory. It needs something with a point on the end of it. So the students of the Royal Institute for Blind Youth started writing in dots with knitting needles, with forks, with nails. They passed each other secret notes. They kept diaries that no adult in the building could read. And the other kids taught the younger kids the whole system in secret, so that even the new students coming in could learn it. Dufo punished them, and it did not work even a little bit. And there was somebody watching all of this, Dufo's own assistant, a man named Joseph Guadet. He'd been observing the students quietly for a while, and at some point, Guadet did something you don't often see a grown-up in charge do. He taught himself the dots. And once he could read them, he understood, and he went to his boss and made the argument. And Dufo changed his mind completely. When the school moved into a brand new building, Dufo handed out a brand new writing slate to every single student. Fast forward to February 1844 in Paris. The new school building was opening, and there was a big public ceremony with important people in the audience, the kind of people who decide what gets money and what doesn't. And Dufo, the man who had burned the books, stood up in front of that crowd and told them about a system of raised dots invented by one of the school's own students. And then they did a demonstration. They brought out a girl, one of the students, and someone read a sentence out loud, and she wrote it down in dots. Then a second student, who had been out of the room the whole time and hadn't heard any of it, came in, put a finger on the paper, and read it back. Out loud, to the room. A man in the audience stood up and declared fake. He said it's a trick. He said they memorized it. He said, obviously somebody told those children what to write before we all got here. And Dufo looked at him and said, fine. You pick. Reach into your pocket. Whatever's in there, read it to her. The man reached into his coat, and what he had in his pocket was a ticket to the theater. So he read it out, right there. Something nobody could have planned, nobody could have memorized. That had been sitting in a stranger's coat all afternoon. And the girl put her stylus on the paper. Punch, punch, punch. And the other student read it back perfectly before the man had even gotten back to his seat. And that room full of important grown-ups stood up and applauded for 6 minutes. 6 minutes. Now that's a really long time. After that day, nobody at that school ever tried to ban Louis' dots again. Louis Braille spent the rest of his life teaching and turning books into dots for the school library, one page at a time. Letters started arriving from all over Europe, from people who wanted to know how it worked. And by now, they'd stopped calling it the dot system. They were calling it by his name, Braille. France made it the official system for every school for blind children in the country. Then, the rest of the world caught up, one country at a time. Right now, today, somewhere near you, there's a sign with bumps on it, on an elevator, on a door, on the front of a medicine bottle. Little clusters of dots, 6 spots each, 2 across and 3 down. And that right there was a 15-year-old's homework. This has been another episode of The Kid Who Did What? Everything in today's episode comes from true accounts of Louis Braille's life and how 6 raised dots invented by a 15-year-old became the way blind people all over the world read and write. Parents, you'll find all of our sources in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time for another episode of The Kid Who Did What?